it's going to emerge very soon if it hasn't already, okay? Because it is a big, big topic right now in teacher education. When you do your methods in student teaching, you're going to be required to do the EDTPA, okay? And the TPA, the Teacher Performance Assessment, one of the pieces, big pieces that they have a rubric for in there is use of academic language. And that is analyzing, when you go to teach a class, what kind of words are you using in your lesson that the students will have to know to make sense of your lesson. And if you think about it, there's a lot of words. They're not only the math and science words, but they're also the education words. I'll give you a concrete example of this. End of last year, I gave my 8th graders a journal prompt. I use journals in my 8th grade math class. And I gave them this journal prompt. I said, in your journal tonight, I want you to summarize what you learned in class today, in your own words, in a paragraph. And one of my 8th graders raised his hand and said, what's the summarize mean? Oops, think about that. Prompt just went down the drain, right? The word summarize just wasn't happening for my class. They maybe have heard the word before, but they didn't know what I meant by that. I mean, we know as adults, but when you say, summarize what you learned today, take yourself back, you're 13 years old, what's that mean? So I used a word, an academic language word, that would have messed them up if somebody hadn't asked that question, because I was, how are you going to respond to that prompt if you don't know what the word means? That happens a lot in math and science classes. We throw a term around, and we think the students know it. I'm going to divide by the coefficient. Good luck. Do you know what a coefficient is? They don't know that word. That sentence just went down the drain, right? Let's see if we can make a hypothesis. If you don't know what a hypothesis is, that sentence didn't do you any good. So words that students are supposed to know, they're academic words. They might have to do with math or science. They might also have to do with just general education kind of words. So one of the things the EDTPA forces you to do is every time you write a lesson plan, you have to identify what the academic language is in your lesson. So for example, a required component in the 3400 class for writing a lesson plan is you've got that academic language piece, and you've got to put a list in there of all of the words that if your students don't know what that word means, this lesson is not going to make sense to them. And you got to think about, how am I going to do it? What am I going to do about that? Am I going to teach that word as I go? Are these definitions students should know? How am I going to make sure that they understand the language of this lesson? Okay? So it's a big thing right now with the TPA getting us. I'll tell you, of all the things that the EDTPA is doing, for me, that has pushed me further into thinking about my teaching than anything I've seen in the last 5 years. Because when I'm teaching my 8th graders, I can't tell you how often I'll say a word and I think, do they know what that means? And a lot of times I will ask them, do you know what that word means? Anybody? Raise your hand if you know. No, nobody knows. And I realize, oh my gosh, I mean, how many times have I used that word over the last 30 years of my career and nobody knew what I was talking about? So when somebody actually focuses you on language, you really start to think about that. So a use of journals could be, how can I promote good use of definitions, terms, language in my classroom by using that journal? What would that do for my students? Right?
Is it hard for you as like a college professor and a middle school professor to use, like, do you catch yourself using words that are inappropriate, like in an 8th grade math classroom, like not applicable?
Yes, I do. I do it all the time, and I do it more now because I'm more sensitive to it because of the EDTPA. And I throw around things with them, and I don't even mean to do it. So I'll say something to them, like somebody will say, they'll bring something up, and I'll say, that's an interesting question. I'm glad you asked that, Jordan, because the Common Core standards call for you to, Common Core standard, we don't know what the Common Core standards are. We talk about those on our campus. What 8th grader cares what the Common Core is? But you know what, we step up and we talk about that a little bit, and so it gives me a chance to talk about that. I use those kind of terms, I definitely catch myself a lot. It's really hard for different audiences. And the weird thing about my day is I can start off teaching 8th graders, and then I can be on campus teaching methods classes in U, and I can go off at 6 o'clock in the evening and be teaching a PD program for in-service teachers that have been teaching for 20 years or more, and I spend the evening with them. By the end of the day, I'm not even sure who my audience is anymore. And that's what it is. Every time you start with a different audience, you got to think, wait a minute, who is my audience here? And you know what, that doesn't just apply to me, it applies to you, because if you're teaching high school, and you've got one class that is freshmen and another class that is seniors. Seniors have a different language base than freshmen do. And there are words you can use with juniors and seniors that go right over the head of the freshmen, right? So you have to adjust every class period. You have to think about, who is my audience? What class am I teaching? What is their background? case in point, the last time we met, and I was trying to pull the word triangulate out of you, and you didn't know the word, right? There's a great example, right? We lived it. We all lived it together. There was a piece of academic language that I thought you knew, because I thought I already taught you that, and I didn't, right? You didn't know what the word meant, so now that, I get 25 blank faces looking at me, what? Right, because we didn't define that word. Listen?
What I think is interesting talking about academic language, the most recent time I've heard it come up is in the Politics Society class. Talked about students who don't know English learning English in the classroom, or students who do know English learning through a different language. It's completely different learning a language outside of class, learning social language, and learning academic language. And academic language, like you said, Common Core to those 8th grade students, that's like a foreign language to them. And to relate that, I think it's just very interesting how it parallels through with even just academic language to an 8th grader or a 9th grader, depending on what academic language you're using. It's like a foreign language to them. And it's like teaching them another language to use in a different setting.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And every kind of setting and every discipline, and I would almost argue every class within a discipline has its own language, you know. So what we do, the other night I was helping my son with his calculus homework, and I said, well, just use the chain rule. Luke gives me this blank stare. Well, we had to use the chain rule to solve the problem. For whatever reason, the word chain rule just wasn't sticking with him. He knew what the rule was. He knew what I meant, but he didn't have the word that did it, you know. So once we started to work through the problem, oh, you mean just where you do this? Yeah, that's called a chain rule. He kind of knew that, but he didn't know what the word was. Again, same question. How often do we do that in our classes? We throw these words out that we think they know, and they really don't. It really forces you in the lesson planning process to think about what words am I going to use today, and how likely are they to know those words. And if I'm not going to know them, how am I going to expose it? Are we going to, am I just going to, in context, I'll use the word and I'll step back and I'll try to define it for them? Is it something we should talk about before we get too far into the lesson? What does that look like? And language development is a big part of that. One of the requirements you have for a methods block is you take a reading in the content area class. And some people take that class and they say, it's not relevant to me. Why am I taking a reading class? I'm a math teacher. I'm a science teacher. You know what? Everybody teaches reading. We got to think about how to make sense with these students in terms of the language that they use, how they visualize things, how they make sense of things. And you can't, no matter what your discipline is, everybody teaches reading. And that class, in fact, is required by the state of Ohio. It's not even a BGSU thing. Everybody has to have it to be licensed, because you've got to think about what impact you're having on language development for the students.
Which class is that?
It's reading in the content area, so it's in the EYA program, it's ETL 4200. And it's a 3-hour course that's part of the methods block. And in the middle childhood program, same thing. It's part of the methods block. I can't remember, of course I remember this off. I don't live it every day, but at any rate, there's an equivalent class. But every program is required to do it early on. Okay.
I thought it was interesting. You said like walking into class, what language am I going to use for this class today?
Yeah.
It also forces you to think about what are my expectations for my students in the language that they use. So, like some teachers, they're fine with me saying, oh, I'm canceling out, and then some are like, you're doing what? No, you're dividing out to one. Or like, you're not foiling, you're doing this. And so like you have to think to yourself, like, what are you going to but like, how are you going to teach your students to use the right language? And like, which language is considered right?
Yeah, that's true. So you're going to see things like you're going to see me be picky in my class when the student says, well, I found the area of the circle and it's 5 inches. No, it's not 5 inches, it's 5 square inches? Oh yeah, I forgot the word square. Yeah, big difference. Big difference between an inch and a square inch. Now you might say, well, really, that's not big of a, they got the idea. No, they didn't get the idea. Do they understand what a square inch is? Do they understand what area is, what volume is? Think about that. How do you define area? What's that mean? We know how to calculate it. Base times height. Got my answer, 40. 40 square inches. What's that mean? What's that word actually mean? And when you really come down to it, I'm going to be picky about those words. And you know what? In the Standards for Mathematical Practice, the SMPs, there is one on using precision. That's what precision is all about. Are you using the right words at the right time? And are you expressing yourself mathematically in a way that is correct? And there's an equivalent one in the science standards. It's all about precision. Right?
What I found through being an SI and also tutoring is that it becomes important to enforce the language when students start to like develop misunderstandings. So like with canceling, a lot of people don't realize that since it's dividing, it has to be a common factor before you can divide. Also, right now we're doing natural logs in calculus, and they'll try to like divide off the natural log because they don't realize that it's a function, not just the variables L and N. And so it's that part where you need to, I feel like it's okay to use the terms cancel and FOIL as long as you realize that you're actually dividing and actually distributing.
Yeah.
But it's when that stops that's when you need to like look back.
Right, because they'll form misconceptions about that, right?
Yeah.
So when a student in my 8th grade class comes up and says, well, I took that equation and I multiplied the 2 through equation, I'll stop them every time. Where's the equation? Right there. Really? What's it have to be an equation? It's not an equation, that's an expression, right? There's no equal sign. Oh, this is an equation, right? But this is an expression. I'm not going to let them get away with that. Right? That's my job as a teacher, is to catch them. Not because I'm being picky, not because I'm a mean guy. The idea is I'm trying to make sure that language-wise they're developing in the right way. That we're not forming misconceptions about what different things mean. And I also won't let them say I just multiplied the 2 through the parentheses. I want them to say I use the distributive property to multiply. You know, are we using the right words in the right situation?
Kind of on topic. There was a recent study on, wasn't this, it was a book written by a teacher who was in a urban classroom, and she was talking about how we always talk about having students rewrite definitions in their own words, but in her classroom, she forces all of her students to know the exact scientific definitions because it helps them develop their academic language, and because they're not asked to develop that at home, it's really important that she does it in her classroom and how much of a difference that makes with her standardized test scores. So like, I thought that was interesting to learn about this, but it was interesting to think that something that we consider to be normal, and it's okay to let students have their own kind of internal definitions, whereas her argument is they can have that own internal definition, but they have to be able to recite the exact science definition.
Right, so an interesting research study would be, are students better off developing an informal definition first, so that they have the idea, and then being given a more precise scientific definition that they have to memorize? Or are they better off knowing what the definition is scientifically first, but then being asked to put it in their own words? Those are two totally opposite teaching strategies, right? I happen to be a believer in the first one, but I'm not sure I can prove it. My gut feeling is that I want you to have a general conceptual understanding of what this word means first, and then once you do, then we can get to the formal part of it later. But even in and of itself, even if we believe that it's important for students to know the scientific definition more or less of memorized, where does that go in the continuum? Is it the first thing we do, the last thing we do, and where do we put that? That's a researchable question. Okay?
I say along those lines, like I found myself like I'll start with a really big definition, and then I kind of like I'm like, okay, I'm going to rewrite that, and then I go back and then I rewrite that one again and like simpler, and then like the more times you do that, the more you lose like from the original. And I feel like it's the same thing. Like if people just keep like missing parts and like reducing it to like get it more simple, then you're working with something that's just completely inaccurate. And so I think it is better to do it opposite, the backwards way instead.
Right. So you